We are streaming. So, more people. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm so glad and just thrilled to see so many people who have want to be a part of this, and that's valuable and meaningful and worthy and exciting. And thank you for being here. And um, so, all good, Alexis. Let me just go over a handful of things before we get started. Number one is that, as you can see, again, this is going to be recorded. And the reason why this is getting recorded is because, you know, I this is a very valuable kind of resource that we're going to have. And I want to be able to,
Israel.
all right, I'm going to mute everybody because it seems as if sometimes people don't realize that they are being uh, um, that they are talking, or you're going to have to unmute yourself when the time comes. So number one, we're recording. Just want everyone to know, because this could be a very valuable resource for various different purposes. I can imagine that the people on this call right now will want to go back and hear some of this in the future, and it will be available to you. I can imagine that you're going to hear something which is really worthy and valuable, and you're going to want to send it maybe to a loved one and say, you could really benefit from listening to this or that. And again, wonderful. There may be a time in which we might use this in the future. So just know that we are recording this, and it's because it could be a really valuable resource. That's number one. Number two is we are dealing with a rainstorm here. It is possible that we might lose power. It happens. If we do lose power, please know that I'm just going to do my best to start the Zoom up over again. That's if the power comes back on. If we lose power indefinitely, then maybe maybe I can do it from I'll probably start it up back from my phone again. So for anyone, if we get disconnected because we lost power, just know that I'll do the best that I can to get it started back up immediately. And again, we'll just do the best that we can.
You might want to make somebody a co-host. That way, if you get dropped,
Well,
the meeting
Ori,
won't get dropped.
that's a good point. Ori is a co-host. So good start, and maybe I'll make one or two other people co-hosts over the course of the evening. Number three, please know that this is the first of 8 sessions, and you're going to get very used to seeing Ori's face because it's twice a week, and it's intense. The sessions are going to go about an hour and 15 minutes or so. Hopefully there's a little bit of time for questions. You're welcome to ask questions during. However, I will do my best to monitor the chat and to see if people have questions. And also if I see a person's hand up, I'll do my best to keep an eye on it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll see it right away. We just do the best that we can. Ori is remarkably interruptible. However, in the way that my experience with him is that you could always just ask a question. However, you want to do so thoughtfully. You don't just want to stop and interrupt in the middle of a thought. But you're certainly welcome to ask questions during the while in the middle of his presentation. He is certainly open to going back, re-explaining something if something needs to happen. Another thing I want to say is, again, there's a lot of things I'm just trying to say ahead of time. So what this means, though, also is that we know that it's possible that you won't be able to be at all 8 sessions. So again, there will be recordings available for you. We understand also that, look, it's hard to be at 8 sessions and over the course of 4 weeks. And so just know that we get it. Do the best that you can. There's no, we're gonna try our best to not make people feel lost at any time, but you never know. And you just do. And again, these recordings are available if you need them. There won't be any quizzes or tests. However, it's this is the intention of this is to go into depth and not just do a cursory overview of what's happening in Israel, as I have done a couple times, but rather to go into true depth and to make you more expert than just listening to, than just knowing some specific little thoughts, but that you know really a lot about Israel, Zionism, from the period of Herzl and his colleagues to the present day. And if you do understand that whole context, it helps you better understand what's happening today. So that's another thing I want to tell you. Now, two more things, and then we'll get started. If I hear, and again, I don't expect this, but I don't necessarily recognize every single name on the participant list. And so if it feels as if someone is intentionally trying to be provocative or hostile for whatever reason, please know that I might kick you out. Again, it's not my, like, asking thought-provoking questions which aren't popular is not a reason to be kicked out. However, being intentionally antagonistic might be. So just for those, I don't necessarily know every single person on our Zoom call right now. Just please know that if you've come in some way just to kind of be intentionally antagonistic, I probably will ask you to leave or I'll kick you out. Finally, there is no charge for this very, very valuable class and 8-part session. No charge at all. However, please know that if you are interested or you are, the spirit moves you and you'd like to help offset the expense of bringing in Ori to be a teacher for 8 parts, and I don't mean to embarrass him because this is now has nothing to do with him, just has to do with me, then you are more than welcome to send a contribution into the temple to help and earmark it for this and help defray the cost. Now, finally, let me just take a moment to talk about Ori for a second, and then I'll turn it over to him. Ori was joined us this year, and he this past summer, so just basically a month ago, and he took us and he joined us and led us and took us around Israel in a very unusual and different type of a trip than ever before. One in which was more of a mission and kind of experiencing and bearing witness to the terrible tragedy of October 7th. As a result, Ori has become kind of like a member of the Temple Beth Shalom family, to be sure. And that is very special. So to have Ori with us, it's more than just having a master teacher and educator on our Zoom teaching us, but also truly now what I consider to be a member of the family. So please know that. And also please know that, my hope is to go back to Israel this coming summer on a trip that's more than just a mission, but also, more of an opportunity to tour and reconnect with the land. And the great likelihood is that if we do move forward and, well, I don't want to say the great likelihood, but my hope, of course, will be that Ori will be joining us again. So if you get to know Ori here and you like him and you want to meet him in person, we'll join the trip this coming June, and you'll have this opportunity. Okay, so Ori Feinberg, is just in brief, is the son of a Reform rabbi. Ori was born in America, but moved to Israel at a very young age and has lived in Israel since. He is, so served in the armies, raised a family, that he is fully an Israeli, even though you will sense from the way he talks that he doesn't have much of an accent because he is, there is a deep American side to him, even though that there is a more deep Israeli side to him. And Ori has the great skill of not only being able to speak firsthand from the perspective of someone who lives there, but also firsthand from the perspective of someone who has studied for years this history of Israel leading and the political circumstances as well. And so we are fortunate because he is, there are few that I feel more confident in doing something like this than Ori Feinberg. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ori at this point. I thank you so much for doing this for us, Ori. And I hope that everybody on this on the Zoom not only agrees that this has been a very worthy experience, but also, and perhaps more importantly, it makes you thirst to learn more and more as we move forward. So Ori, it's on you now. Thank you very much. Oh, you're muted, so unmute yourself.
All right, thank you, Rabbi. And is it possible, I know other people are probably going to be coming in as well. There seems to be a beep every time. Is there a way to mute that kind of waiting room entry beep? If there is, that'd be great.
Probably
And
now, because I'll mute myself.
okay, there's it really is a pleasure to be with all of you. And I'm going to just briefly precede our session with a few words so that we can jump right in. And I will say that on the one hand, it's wonderful to see all of my friends again who I've met so recently. It seems like yesterday we were together, and I'm looking forward to engaging with and meeting the rest of you who are here. My name is Uri, and I was born in the States. Home base for us was Chicago before we moved to Israel when I was 10 years old and grew up in Jerusalem. Somewhat of a normative path, I'd say. School, high school, military, travel after that, like many of us, to get off the island and stretch our legs a bit. Came back and have been involved in Jewish education for all of my professional life. I'll say more about that in a moment, but more importantly, I'm married to Meryl, originally from Brooklyn, New York. She immigrated after college, and we have 3 daughters. Our oldest daughter is Meitav, who is 24. Shira is 21. She actually just got out of her military service 2 weeks ago. And Adi is 17, and she's still in school, about to start 12th grade. So that's us really on one foot. We live in the city of Modi'in, where I'm speaking to you from, which is about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, one of the oldest cities in the world, where the Maccabean revolt is most likely, if it didn't start here, it started near here back in 167 before the Common Era, and one of the newest cities in the world. Groundbreaking for the modern city of Modi'in was in 1994. The first people moved here in 1996. I moved here with my wife in 1999. There were 17,000 people who were living. Today, there's 100,000 people, and the goal is 250,000. The reason we're getting together, though, is not to talk about the city of Modi'in really in depth, at least not at this juncture. It's not even for me to share that when I talk about my experience in Jewish education, it starts with the nifty teen trips as a leader of those trips in the summers through my undergrad, to then teaching in the high school in Israel program of the Reform movement, teaching Jewish history for 7 or 8 years, and then teaching in a similar program called the Alexander Muss High School in Israel program, also Jewish history, in between completing my the tour guiding course, which is 2 years, and my master's degree, which is in contemporary Jewish studies. We also, my wife and children and I, spent 3 years in the States to be closer to my wife's family, who are mostly in New York, but also in Boston. And we spent 3 years in Boston. I worked as the director of education of a Reform synagogue there. And the intention was always to come back because this is where we wanted to raise our kids. And our 2 older ones, who are now out of their military service, but are knee-deep in their reserve duty, and have spent, our oldest spent about 120 days since October 7th in the reserves. And so far, my middle daughter, Shira, got out and went right back in for a week. Now she's out for a bit, and she'll come back into reserve. So we're at a very interesting juncture, I would say. And I am obviously belittling this juncture by using the word interesting. There's so many more adjectives that I can use to describe where we're at right now. We're here together at this very last minute planned course in order to delve into something which demands a certain sense of urgency. And that is to provide as much information as we can revolving what is happening in Israel now and has been happening since October 7th. However, in order to understand that we got here from somewhere and that October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, our goal is not just to talk about the immediate proceedings that led to October 7th, but in fact to give us as strong and stable a platform as we can, going back in history to better understand the steps leading up to the events that gave us this unprecedented and painful reality. And we're doing this not only to give information, but so that we can use that information as we try and decipher for ourselves, why do I feel the way that I feel right now? Either we're just going to strengthen what you already know, and maybe we'll add layers to what you know. So that's big picture. Now, how it's going to work, and there's a little bit of a longer intro today. Usually when we get together, we're going to hit the ground and just go running. Our sessions are going to run about an hour and 15, and I'm happy to extend it and just be around for an hour and a half if, in fact, there are any questions at the end of our session. I will say that because there is an immense amount of information, of course, which we're only going to provide, I wouldn't say scratching the surface, but obviously in an hour and 15, an hour and a half, there's only so much we can provide. I am going to steer away from what is perhaps more classically an ideal learning situation with a start, stop as far as questions and answers and going back and trying to discern. I am going to offer that if there are questions, that we push them towards the end if possible. If there's something that's burning, as Rabbi said, he will monitor the chat room. You can put it in the chat. And if you say, Rabbi, I need to know this answer right now, Rabbi, please feel free to interrupt me and we'll do what we can do. But otherwise, I will focus towards the end of the session to try and grapple with any questions, knowing that sometimes we may go over that 115, utilizing all of our time together. And if that's the case, and you find that your questions weren't answered, or that your questions only came after we ended, Rabbi, I'm more than happy to have my email shared in the chat right now so that people can reach out in between sessions and ask their questions. And if I can, I will get to it and answer you. If not, then within the week for sure. Okay, so we're going to leave it at that. The other thing that I'll say, technologically speaking, is that we're going to use a presentation via Zoom, and Zoom has allowed us an opportunity to engage even if we're not in the same room. But there can be challenges. As you have a rainstorm, we may be in a situation where I have to duck out, not because of rain, but as I'm sure you all know, with your hands on the pulse, we're essentially waiting for the sirens to start. If that's the case, you may see me dash out of here, and if need be, I'll pick it up and we'll continue our Zoom in my safe room here in our house. Otherwise, we'll wait a few minutes, and obviously Rabbi will be in touch via WhatsApp to see what's going on. And as far as the PowerPoint that'll be the backdrop of what I'm going to teach, it's not professionally done, but hopefully it will help convey the information in a way that allows us to be able to connect some dots. All right, so that's big picture. If there's any issues, obviously, we'll just take a deep breath and we'll figure them out as we go. So that is a pretty long-winded intro, but we're going to put that aside now. And if there's any other questions, obviously, we'll answer whatever we can. And we'll just start and we'll hope for the best. Does that sound okay? All right, excellent. All right, here we go. Okay. So what we're looking at here, the image that you see is in fact a very significant image, and that is May 14th, 1948. And I place this here not because this is going to be where we start from, because one might think, well, the history of the state of Israel, why don't we start with May 14th, 1948 at 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon when David Ben-Gurion declares the state of Israel a reality. And the reason for that is because we don't start in 1948 in a complete vacuum. There's got to be another starting point. And for that purpose, we see here a series of 6 chapter headings. Now, we know our sessions will include 8 sessions altogether. The last 2 are going to focus on the war itself. But leading up to that, we're going to, well, essentially try and break down that history into biteable sessions that allow us to go from A to B and B to C and C to D, and thus give us the tools, as I mentioned before, to connect the dots. And we're going to start with our first session, which we called Zionism, a Lifetime of Preparation. Now, as we're going to start, I think it's important that we recognize that there's going to be terminology that some of us might know like the back of our hand. And for some of us, it may be the first time that we're hearing it. And that's okay. And therefore, we're going to ask ourselves a few questions before we begin. And there's still the binging there, so it must be on each of our computers, or maybe because I'm a co-host, that's why I'm hearing the binging of the incoming waiting room. So before we begin, we do in fact want to ask ourselves a few questions, such as, what is in fact Zionism? And in order to understand what Zionism is, we have to ask a few other questions. When does Zionism begin? And also, how long have the Jewish people been yearning? Now, even embedded in the last question, I think we can recognize that, well, there's something about yearning involved with Zionism, and therefore, we're going to try and figure out, when should we begin understanding about what Zionism is. Now, the first clip that we're going to hear, and there'll be various clips and different modalities that will allow us to grapple with all of this information. The sound might not be all the way up, but that's okay. It won't make or break your understanding of Jewish history. But we're going to start with a movie some of you might have seen way back when. And this, of course, is 1960s. In 1960 was what became a quintessential watershed moment in the annals of American Jewish history, and that is the movie Exodus.
Every time I come home, I stop here and just look for it.
Beautiful.
Valley of Jezreel.
Now, for some of you who may not know, Exodus is the book Exodus, and then later the movie Exodus is an amalgam of various pre-state period stories. There was an Exodus ship, which we'll get to in about 3 sessions, but in this particular case, we have Ari Ben Canaan, the captain of this ship Exodus, played by one good-looking Jew, Paul Newman. Eva St. Marie is going to be the Presbyterian nurse who is alongside him. And what we have in this particular image you see on the screen is Ari Ben Canaan looking out at the Jezreel Valley. And what he embodies, we'll just see it just in a moment a little bit more. There, that stance right there. And that stance embodies in it what we're going to try and understand about what Zionism represents. But it's not just about a love of the land of Zion. But let's see where it begins. Hold on. There we go.
Isn't your father's name Barak?
Russia, he was Yakov Robinsky. But when he came here, he took the name of Deborah's general. He called himself Barak Ben Canaan, Barak, the son of Canaan. And this valley became a Jewish land once again. He can give you the date that every clump of trees was planted down into the month.
Get excited. We're not debating now. I'll grant anything you say.
Well, I just wanted you to know that I'm a Jew. This is my country.
So we have here is Paul Newman or Ari Ben Knaan making it very clear the continuum between the fact that his father can go ahead and name the time and month of which each tree was planted in the valley, and the fact that he is a Jew. And that look of determination in his eye is as significant than as the words that he used. But there's got to be another element, because if we're looking at about 150 years ago from where we are right now in his own presentation, Zionism, well, does it go back any farther? So let's take a look for a moment and see how long, in fact, have we been yearning?
Know your Bible?
In a Presbyterian sort of way.
That's Mount Tabor.
I remember where Deborah gathered her armies.
That's where she stood when she watched Barak march out to fight the Canaanites. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor and 10,000 men with him. To the book of Judges. The Canaanites had 900 iron chariots. Barak had men 3,200 years ago. That's when the Jews first came to this valley, wasn't it?
So we're talking not just 150 years ago, or not just Ari Ben Knaan's father connected to Zionism, but it seems that for thousands of years, we have had an integral and a personal connection with this land of Israel. So then we now figure out where our starting point is. For understanding the modern concepts of Zionism, we have to go back. Now, biblically speaking, that's where the origin of the word Zion comes from. We know it's mentioned about 151 times in the Bible, primarily in the second segment of the Tanakh being the Bible made up of the Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. It's going to be found in the prophets section and in the writings section. We hear it for the first time, by the way, in the book of Samuel, in reference to this new city that's being created by King David. And the stronghold, which becomes the city of Jerusalem, will be identified as Zion. It will later also represent not just the city of David, but also the land itself. And of course, if we want to follow through in the biblical narrative, we know that our first temple is going to be destroyed in the year 586 before the Common Era. And when that happens, the Babylonians will exile us to, well, Babylon. And when we get to Babylon, we find ourselves on the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, which, by the way, this is the Euphrates River that you can see in the image. And we know that, well, Bonnie M gives us
by the rivers of here we sat down.
Now, we can decide that Babylon is in fact going to be our starting point and exile as we begin to yearn to return one day. Now, if we had all the time in the world, I would probably get into the trajectory of the Jewish people that takes us after Babylon, after Persia conquers Babylon in 538 before the Common Era, and then we're allowed to return and we rebuild our temple into what will become the Second Temple. By the way, all of this timeline that I'm about to give you is not what you need to remember. It's just to allow us to connect some dots and to figure out how, in fact, have we been holding on to this yearning for so many years? Because when we come back to the land, we're going to live here as an autonomy under the Persians, but then the Greeks are going to conquer in 332 before the Common Era, eventually with Alex the Great, and things are going to be good until they're not, and then we're going to have to rebel against the Greeks because Judaism is outlawed, and we have the Hanukkah story with the Maccabees that I already mentioned once already. And then we can also go into the Roman period, or we can go into how Rome is ultimately going to go ahead and destroy the Second Temple. And we could then understand that we, well, once again, stayed in the land and also left the land and headed out west. And as we do this, and we find ourselves now east towards Babylon and west towards what later becomes Europe, we have another good anchor in that continuum of yearning. And that is given to us by Rabbi Judah Halevi, Yehuda Levi, who is a pillar of what will be known as the golden age of Spain. And this Rabbi Yehuda Levi, who was a poet and a philosopher and a physician, and well, he was a Renaissance man, even before the Renaissance was a thing, is going to give us a whole slew of poetry. And poetry that deals with love, that deals with limericks, that deals with yearning to return, such as my heart is in the east and I am at the ends of the west. And how can I taste what I eat? And how could it be pleasing to me? Well, you can see very clearly that there is this deep desire, even if physically we are out of the land, to be in the land. Now, fortunately for us, we have a bookshelf here, not that different than the bookshelf behind the rabbi himself. And this, in fact, is another kind of Jewish bookshelf. And if we wanted to, if we were going to jump and propel ourselves up to our starting point of Zionism in the 19th century, I would open this book right now that I just took off the shelf. This book called The Innocents Abroad. The Innocents Abroad was written by Mark Twain, who set out on a journey in 1867. When he sets out on his journey with his fellow Americans, he is going to travel to Europe and to the Holy Land. And when he arrives, he is going to begin to write down articles that he sends back to his newspaper in San Francisco. Now, as he chronicles his excursion, which later he will call the Great Pleasure Excursion on the Quaker City, that's the name of the ship, these letters will be collected into what is his most sought after and bestseller in his lifetime, called The Innocents Abroad. And he shares for us what his experiences were in only as Mark Twain can. And this is what he writes from his experiences when he's here in 1867. Of all the lands there are of dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they are dull of color, they are unpicturesque in shape. The valleys are unsightly deserts fringed with feeble vegetation that has an expression about it of being sorrowful and despondent. Every outline is harsh, every feature is distinct. There is no perspective. Distance works no enchantment here. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. Palestine is desolate and unlovely. And why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? Now, I know for a fact that there is at least a handful of you who have been in Israel before. And because we're such a large group, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that others have been to Israel before. I can imagine that for those of you who have traveled the length and the breadth of the country, Palestine is desolate and unlovely? Really? Not so much. It's a pretty beautiful landscape, even the desert. So either Mark Twain wasn't all that, or something else is happening here. And because we know that Mark Twain knew how to put pencil to paper, then what he is describing is actually what he saw in the late 1860s. And therefore, the transformation had to happen somehow. Now, just for a moment, I want to open up parentheses for a second, and just to let us know that that word Palestine, which has come to embody in our historical narrative the land of Israel, comes from somewhere. And while what I'm about to share with you has nothing to do with whether or not there is a Palestinian people today, because there is, and we will get to that as we move down the road in our historical stepping stones. The origin of the word Palestine is, in fact, given to the land by first the Greeks as they expand the greater Syria that was under their control to include what was then called Judah or Judea, to be known as Palestine or Palestina. And the reason was, well, it was a historical reference to the ancient Philistines who lived in the region. But truly, the land of Judea, that is the land of Israel, was given the imprint of the word and the name and the title Palestine by the Romans. And it happens in the aftermath, not of the first great revolt in which we rebelled against Rome in 66 to the Common Era, which saw the destruction of the temple in the year 70, the Second Temple. But in fact, just a little bit later, we rebelled a second time in the year 132 to the Common Era when we rebel against Rome. And this time, we're going to have a Jewish spiritual leader by the name of Rabbi Akiva and a military Jewish leader by the name of Shimon Bar Kokhba. And we will rebel in what will be known as the Bar Kokhba Rebellion that lasts 3 years, which we lose, as Hadrian, the emperor, is going to crush us now a second time. And as punishment, he will not only change the name of Jerusalem to Ilia Capitolina, named after himself, Ilia Hadrian, Capitolina being the altar to Jupiter. He will also say, Jews, we're now going to give a posthumous victory to your biblical arch enemies, the Philistines. And hence we're going to go ahead and take that name Palestina and superimpose it on Judea. But I digress, because if we're seeing this ongoing yearning, what happened that caused the 19th century to be the century in which Zionism as a movement, not as a concept, but as a movement was born? Okay, so what in fact is different? Let's just erase this. And let's go ahead and see what are, in fact, the changing circumstances as we're about to enter this modern era. First of all, we're looking in the 19th century, and this is, you're going to have to dust off your memories of your high school history classes, in which we know that the 19th century is going to see multiple revolutions that are going to revolve around certain groups of like-minded countries to say, we're going to, well, you can see on the blackboard there, we want to be able to have absolute control, and we're going to remove any small medieval residue of smaller groups conjoining around some principality. We're also going to have language and our personal unified history as being the glue which brings us together. And just because you have a particular dialect of the language and you have a particular dialect of the language, you're not going to anymore be secluded and on your own, but we're going to come under one loyalty and one umbrella. We also know that the 19th century is going to see things like the Industrial Revolution. It's also going to see, because of that, new economies evolve. And we're going to also see a shift in where those economies are going to play out internationally. No longer focused in the Mediterranean basin, but we're going to see the shift out towards the Atlantic and towards the West. All of that is going to, well, also provide us with a new backdrop of how peoples will be engaged with each other as they create new political relationships, which include different kinds of, well, concepts relating to democracy. All of this is going to provide for us the backdrop we need to better understand how the Jews were able to develop a movement called Zionism, that is a love of the land of Zionism, of Zion, in this 19th century. Now, if we're looking at the map that we see here at the beginning of the 19th century, this is, of course, mostly the map of Europe that we see, where we know that this century will see different clusters of like-minded groups coming together and demanding independence. For example, we know that in 1832, the islands around Greece are going to solidify themselves under one leadership as they break away from the Ottoman Empire. And Italy is going to go ahead in 1870, after several different revolutions. Also, the Italian states are going to come together and unify themselves with independence. And of course, Germany, we know at the end of the Franco-Prussia War in 1871, is going to congeal themselves, and all the Germanic states will go ahead and identify a similar language, a geographic space, a shared history. All of this is going to come together into what will be a first step in a German independence, as it were. And therefore, this backdrop is essential for us to understand so that we can perhaps, within this context, better understand why, well, other nationalisms would be prime and ready to emerge. Now, before we do that, we do have to take another step back. And that step back is essential because before we talk about the changes happening within Jewish society in the 19th century, I think we should acknowledge that we're not changing in a vacuum, and Europe is going through those changes as well. Or maybe not the same changes, their own changes. And part of that has to do with what will be called the Enlightenment. And while I mentioned the word Renaissance before, there are different starting points even to describe when the Enlightenment begins. I think there is a figure that stands out as one that perhaps is that teetering watershed moment that allows us to say, this is a good starting point. And that, of course, is this Augustinian monk by the name of Martin Luther, who's going to go ahead and challenge the leadership of the day. And the leadership of the day was the church. And October 31st, 1517, he will take his 95-point thesis and nail it onto the church doors, demanding that the indulgences that they were all demanded to pay in order to absolve themselves of their sins and reach salvation. Well, that's just the Catholic clergy demanding power from them. And there's real question to the efficacy of these indulgences. Interesting enough, as this is happening and a new stream of Christianity is going to develop, and the challenge of science is going to right there be in the doorway, breaking through alongside this Augustinian monk, there's a first attempt to include the Jews in this revolution. As in 1523, Martin Luther is going to write a book called Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, in order to say to the Jews, hey, we're in this together. We're all against the Catholic Church. Now, to his surprise, perhaps, the Jews reject Martin Luther, and it doesn't take very long for Martin Luther to turn on a dime, and by the 1530s has already very vehemently changed his attitude towards the Jews. But it's going to be this attempt to allow the human mind to be the cornerstone of how we identify our place in the world, and not the colorful windows of the church and the Catholic priests being the one to dictate how we are able to live our lives. Now, that's happening in the 16th century. There is also going to be something called the Jewish Enlightenment, or in the Hebrew, Haskalah. Haskalah comes from the word sechel. Sechel means mind. Now, this is going to be a couple hundred years down the road, and that is at the beginning of the 18th century. We're going to start to see real changes that will include being able to identify that there are changes out there within the Christian world that do affect us, but we Jews are also evolving and changing along the way, just because that's who we are. And if we wanted to pair the two concepts alongside of each other, we know that the Enlightenment is an understanding that human beings have the intellect to understand the world around them for themselves, whereas Haskalah is going to be the process of understanding that outside world for sure, but there's also an internal drive. Now, this idea of Jewish enlightenment will be propelled forward by, well, the gentleman that you see on the screen, Moses Mendelssohn. Now, before I talk about Moses Mendelssohn, let's just remember that as we emerge from the Middle Ages into this modern world, or what will become a modern world, we have to remember that Jews entered into that modern reality as a distinct national and cultural unit with a very unique identity, different than any of the peoples with whom they interacted. And it was their religion and their culture and their nationality which they carried with them wherever they went. And it would be this celebration of these three integral parts that would not only seclude them enough to protect them from the outside world, but it would also allow them a touch point to our past. And it's that touch point to our past which gave us the strength we needed, so we felt back then in the 15th and the 16th and the 17th centuries, to move forward within the evolving non-Jewish societies amongst whom we were living. Interesting enough that faith for Jews was the main link in this chain of continuity. And for Christianity, faith was a melting pot, allowing lots of different groups to leave the Middle Ages behind and leave the past behind and propel them forward. Now, Moses Mendelssohn, who was born in Dessau in what would have been a traditional Jewish environment, and really we would say Orthodox, but I'm using a term anachronistically, as Orthodox Judaism didn't exist. It was essentially just Jewish. And it would be, however, when he was 14 years old, that Moses Mendelssohn would leave Dessau for the big city of Berlin in the 18th century. And when he moves to Berlin, he is not only going to learn German and Latin and English and French and master them all and study philosophy, and he will become known as the German Socrates. He is going to go ahead and recognize that an involvement with the world around us isn't going to diminish our Jewish identity and our Judaism, but rather it's going to strengthen our place in the world, both as Germans, but also as Jews. And by giving the Jewish people the opportunity to learn German and open those doors, we can in fact enter into modernity, not as Christians, but as Jews. This is all very significant because if in the 18th century we're seeing this evolution, it's also not happening in a vacuum. We take just a couple hundred years step back. By the 16th century, most of the expulsions that have taken place are already completed, going back from the 13th century all the way through the 16th century and into the 17th century, as Jews are being kicked out of different countries throughout Europe, Spain, Portugal, England, different places. As this is happening, and we have to adapt ourselves as we go, we realize that there are some serious snags along the way. And by the 16th into the 17th century, Jews find themselves primarily in the Polish Lithuania area or the Ottoman Empire. Now, as we make our way through the 17th century, we're going to have some real trials and tribulations, such as 1648 and what will be known as the Khmelnytsky massacres, in which Bogdan Khmelnytsky, an Orthodox Christian Ukrainian, is going to rise up against their Polish Catholic princes who are their masters. And of course, in the middle, the Jews will be right there to take the brunt of this Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as about 100,000 will be slaughtered over the course of about 2.5 to 3 years. In addition, 1666 sees the rise of a false messiah by the name of Shabtai Tzvi that crushes the very center of hope that the Jewish people have for a messianic era, as it becomes clear that he was not the Messiah. This is going to push not only new ways of thinking about, well, modernity, but new ways of thinking about traditional Judaism, as we have at the beginning of the 18th century, a man by the name of Yisrael ben Eliezer, also known as the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov, based in Poland, that's where Hasidut or Hasidism will be born, is going to take Judaism and infuse it with spirituality, mysticism, a recognition of the beauty all around us. It's not to say that we're rejecting Talmud or Tanakh or our prayer book and prayers, but we're incorporating the beauty of the world around us. Interesting enough, surprise, surprise, we don't all always see eye to eye. And shortly after Hasidut or Hasidism rises, there will be, well, juxtaposed to that, a group of Jews revolve around a rabbi who will be known as the Gaon of Vilna, Rabbi Eliezer, the genius of Vilna in Lithuania, who will say, no, 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 that spirituality, that mysticism, that's what got us into trouble to begin with because of the previous century atrocities. We have to double down on the Talmud and in our studies. And therefore, you Hasidism, you're not even Jewish. There was real tension. And that group that followed the Lithuanian Gaon of Vilna were known as the opposers or the mitnagdim. Okay, that's the ground for Moses Mendelssohn to enter. Now, interesting enough that Moses Mendelssohn, while he did not want to do away with Judaism, but allow Jews a safe space with which to harness their Jewish identity in a modern world, of his 6 children, only 2 continued to live their lives as Jews. But as one of his children, Abraham, who was one who married a Christian woman, and he himself converted to Christianity, in which they decided to raise their daughter, that is Moses Mendelssohn's granddaughter, as a Christian, said, my dear daughter, and I'm paraphrasing here, we're choosing to raise you as a Christian because ultimately both religions speak of goodness and being good people. And if you can be a good person and also have a leg up in the world, then why not? Now, the question then is, did it in fact work? We see that for Mendelssohn, maybe not exactly as he planned it. Was it an easy process? Of course it wasn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking. And therefore, we just have to spell it out. What was, in fact, this process? So we have now, in the 18th century, a question of how should I remain as a Jew? Or should I remain a Jew in the world around me? If I convert out of my Jewish identity, am I going to allow myself a ticket to the new world? How do I reconcile my own religious connection with a completely different religion? These are, in fact, questions that, well, it's not easily done. You can't just write off your religion. And in fact, for those who were growing up within this new world of choices of how to be a Jew, in particular, do I hold on to that traditional Jewish existence? Or am I going to follow the ways of the Haskalah and therefore be within a group known as the Maskilim? These Maskilim, these enlightened Jews, are not looking to change their religion for another one. Christianity had its issues as well. Question is, how do I solidify that Jewish identity? So is in fact home sweet home, as we see here on the screen, is it in fact the land of Israel that we can see where the arrow is pointed? Actually, not so much, because for the Maskilim, the land of Israel wasn't the cornerstone of their Jewish identity. But in fact, we are beginning to see in the 18th century, Haskalah provide, well, something that never existed before. If in fact Jewish identity was embodied within this trifecta of the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the religion of Israel, well, right now, if you're going to tell me that we have to yearn to return to a homeland, I will tell you, you are wrong, because my homeland is Germany. We didn't come here. We were always here. We're not outsiders. This is our land, and we're going to live as Jews in this land. So we're starting to see the disappearance of that triangle of what was the cornerstone of holding us together as a Jewish people seems to begin, at least in earnest, with the Jewish Enlightenment of the 18th century. Now, this 18th century is going to see several kinds of revolutions, including, of course, we know 1776, which will influence across the pond what happens in 1789, liberté, égalité, fraternité, with the French Revolution. And lo and behold, the French people are enfranchised, and we do away with the monarchy, and we have the bourgeoisie rise up. And 2 years after that, in 1791, even Jews are given freedom, and even Jews are emancipated and enfranchised. Now, we jump ahead to the beginning of the 19th century in 1806, and we know that Napoleon is going to turn to the Jews and say, hey, Jews, you can stay French, but you have to choose. Are you French or are you Jewish? Because interesting enough, Napoleon knew, well as we do, that Judaism wasn't just a religion, but it was in fact the embodiment of three parts: that sense of peoplehood, Am Yisrael, the sense of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and of course the Torah of Israel, or the religion of Israel. And Napoleon collects 71 members of the Jewish leadership of France, and he creates and convenes what will be known as Napoleon's Sanhedrin, or the Paris Sanhedrin of 1806, in which he tells them, you need to decide, are you French or are you Jewish? You can continue to be Jewish as a religion, that is, just like there's Frenchmen who are Catholic and Frenchmen who are Protestant, you will be Jewish. But your language has to be French, your land has to be France, and your people have to be French. And this 71 member, by the way, 71, emulating the Sanhedrin, which was the main body of Jewish leadership back in the Second Temple period, chooses at the end of this conference to in fact be, as they will identify themselves, Frenchmen of Mosaic persuasion. Why not Jewish? Why Mosaic persuasion? Because Jewish had a bad taste. It left a bad taste in the mouth. It had negative connotations, and therefore the Jews of France, the beginning of the 19th century, choose to be Frenchmen of Mosaic persuasion. Now, why is this significant? Because this will be the canary in the coal mine as far as the ebb and flow of the Jewish trajectory in Europe at that time. We're talking about Central and Western Europe. So then, does that mean that we're looking at, well, either we can assimilate or even convert? Now, do we do that positively in that we are running towards something, or in fact, we're running away from our own Jewish identity and denying our religion because, well, we see where that gets us? As we enter into this 19th century, there seems to be a bit of a conundrum here as what European society thought versus where Jews were. You know what happens when we assume, of course, what happens to you and to me, and that was what was going on in Europe as well. Europeans thought, okay, Jews, listen, we're giving you the opportunity to be part of, well, the main part of society and be Christian. And okay, so we'll accept your issues, but you'll be on the sidelines. Jews are saying, especially those maskilim that we spoke about, don't do me any favors. I want to be equal based on a society constructed on rationalist foundations. And I want to be accepted not just as the Jews, but also as an individual. This is that platform where, well, misconceptions are going to evolve. And if this is our relationship outward, we recognize as Jews in the 19th century that we have to deal both with those locals, meaning the Christian society, because we haven't yet gotten to our existence under Islam, which would be more the case within the Ottoman Empire. We have to deal with our local Jewish society. What is, in fact, our Jewish society in our town going to look like? Will we be Haskalah? Will we be traditional? What are we going to look like? And are we, in fact, part of a larger Jewish people? Is that an integral part still to our identity as Jews? So, could it, in fact, be that we have two main options then in the 19th century? Either we stick to our guns, we focus on being part of Jewish tradition, doubling down on that, or we reject it all and we either assimilate without officially converting, or we take on a whole new faith for the purpose of distancing ourselves from everything that we once knew because, well, what are you going to do? We're in modern times now. Was there any other path? Well, I'm glad you asked the question because yes, there was. And at the beginning of the 19th century, actually in Germany, and we're not going to break down every pillar that we see on the screen right now, but we should know that there were attempts to provide us a life vest so that we didn't have to reject completely our Judaism, but allow our Judaism to evolve. And whether we look at the founders of three streams of Judaism that were born at the beginning of the 19th century, either classical Reform Judaism, which I'll just be clear, is different than the Reform movement today. It has its roots in what was identified as classical Reform Judaism, conservative, or neo-Orthodoxy, later to be more commonly known as modern Orthodoxy. And again, whether we're looking at the differences of the evolution of these different groups in the origin of the Torah, or is Judaism in fact fixed or not? Are we allowed to change Jewish law, halacha, or not? Or if we want to go ahead and decide what is in fact the essence of our particular stream of Judaism. For classical Reform Jews, be a good person, believe in one God. There you go, ethical monotheism. Jewish life is a culture or historical positive Judaism, meaning there is a rich history to Judaism, conservative Judaism says, but we can adapt that Jewish law as needed as long as we work through the community. And as far as neo-Orthodoxy goes, it was okay to reform Jews, but God forbid, literally, we reform Judaism. And therefore, the key of our Jewish stream now, neo-Orthodoxy, will be, in fact, Jewish law. So these changes are providing more color to the Jewish landscape of Central and Western Europe and in the 19th century. Now, what you have in front of you, of course, is the Russian Empire. And Jews found themselves in what would become known as the Russian Empire already from the 7th century to the Common Era. And as Jews are making their way here, and this is going to have its own very rich history, of course, but if the cornerstone of European Jewry, that is European Christianity, that is Central and Western European Christianity, is Catholicism or Protestantism, it would be the various Eastern Orthodox Christianities that would be the cornerstone of what evolves in Russia. For our purposes, we're going to focus on the end of the 18th century into the 19th century because that's going to be a period of time in which Tsarist Russia will reign. And if you remember Catherine the Great, Alex I, Nicholas I, Alex II, Alex III, Nicholas II, if you ever want to remember that particular group of czars, remember the word Canaan. Catherine, Alexander, Nicholas, well, you get it. Either way, for us, we're going to see a different trajectory of emancipation in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately for us, with the rise of Catherine the Great, we're going to see already from 1791 all the way to like 1917, Jews to be formally regulated to the western reaches of the Russian Empire into what is known as the Pale of Settlement. The word pale, by the way, comes from the Latin palus, which is the word for a stake in the ground, as if identifying the ring that held in the fence that kept Jews out of mainland Russia and kept us in this strip of area that is Moldova and Ukraine and Eastern Europe, Eastern Poland, meaning that's what includes today. Now, as Jews find themselves here, we will be living in this Pale of Settlement, sometimes with a little bit more freedom, sometimes with a little bit less freedom, and it really depends on who is ruling, whether it's going to be Alex the First or it's going to be Nicholas the First. And let's take a look for a second that when Alex the First, who rules from about 1801 to 1825, he is going to, well, try and kill us with kindness. There'll be a little bit more freedoms. Jews will be able to gain a little bit more land. If you had a certain degree that you learned, you may even be able to live outside of the Pale of Settlement. However, it's going to be Nicholas the First who's going to go ahead and, well, really, what's the saying? Twist the screws or I don't remember what the saying is, but you know what I mean. Make things harder. The forced conversions, coercion, assimilation, the idea was to try and reform the Jew, not reform Judaism, but we're going to not make it worth a Jew's worthwhile to continue to be Jewish. And laws like Cantonist laws are intended to rip Jews from within their society, because even the Russian czars knew the significance of the Jewish community to the establishment of a strong Jewish group. And if you remove the Jew from their community by, for example, making their recruitment to the military at the age of 12, which of course is before the age of bar mitzvah, you are going to completely dissemble and dismember that Jewish community. Whether it's forced baptisms, etc., this is all part of an attempt to try and destroy Jewish life in Russia. Now, while all this is going on, we're going to see, as you can see on the screen, that there is also the evolution of Jewish enlightenment, of the Haskalah. Now, it's going to be a different kind, and it's going to take different focus, but the attempts will be for the purpose of finding a balance within a strong Jewish community and a changing modern world. We are, however, going to see, well, differences in Eastern European Haskalah. So let's get rid of this screen for a moment and recognize that the reason there's a different trajectory to the evolution of Jewish enlightenment is because for those Jews in Eastern Europe, well, they felt that they were very different than their Western Jewish co-religionists. And they felt that there's nobody we're trying to emulate here. The Russians around us are poor, they're not educated, and in fact, we don't mind tradition. It's a central part of who we are. Now, the uneducated part of the local villager did not inspire the Jews, did not raise them up, as was the case as Moses Mendelssohn became what was known as a Salon Jew, as that strata of the higher echelons of East Central and Western European society was looking to have these very educated Jews a part of their inner circle. That was not the case in Eastern Europe. And the evolution of the Enlightenment in Eastern Europe took different directions, such as we're not going to learn the local languages and master them like we did in Central and Western Europe. By the way, in parentheses, not the first time we did that either, mastering French and German and English, but we mastered Greek and we mastered Arabic. We did that, and not just to understand the locals, but to create. We use these languages with creativity. In Eastern Europe, we actually turned to Hebrew as that language that we would master, not for the purpose of the closed text, that is, the religious text for which Hebrew was used. And when it wasn't, we had the common language, the mundane language, the weekly language of Yiddish, which had evolved, which, by the way, in and of itself was not a language created solely for the purpose of working through our week without having to focus on Hebrew, but rather we harnessed Hebrew and we harnessed Yiddish to become language of creativity, of poetry, of philosophy, of literature. Now, in 1855, when Alex II takes the throne, we're going to see that he is once again going to try and kill us with kindness, as we begin to see that, well, these Cantonist laws are going to be abolished. Thank you very much. 25 years is enough. And Jews will be allowed to move around the Pale of Settlement. And even if you get a particular degree, spread your wings and even gain more real estate outside of the Pale. Now, whether or not this kind of reform was enough to strengthen that Jewish center, that's going to come to an end in mid-March of 1881, when Alex II will be assassinated by revolutionaries. And when he's assassinated, well, as you can imagine, and as you probably remember, it's not good for the Jews, because the Jews will be blamed for the assassination, and this will not invent the concept of the pogrom, but it will absolutely fan the flames of those embers that are already there. And just to remind us, at the very end of Fiddler on the Roof, we know that the community has to leave Anatevka.
Well, Anatevka hasn't exactly been the Garden of Eden.
That's true.
After all, what have we got here? A little bit of this, a little bit of that.
A pot, a pan, a broom.
A hat.
Someone should have set a match to this place years ago. A bench, a tree. What's a house?
Or a stove.
People who pass through in that Tefka don't even know they've been here. Stick of wood, piece of cloth.
Now, we could stay here all night and really watch this all the way through, but we know that the Russians are coming and they will destroy everything in their path. And therefore, in that 18th century, and in that turning point of the 1880s, we're going to see, well, two main choices that will be left to Jews. And one is going to be leaving the old country, and in this particular case, an old country, as we know their Jewish people have multiple old countries, in this case, of course, Eastern Europe and Russia, and they make their way to the Golden Medina. In fact, between 1881 and 1924, when America shuts its gates to immigration, we're going to see about 2.2 million Jews make that journey and see this particular view of the Statue of Liberty, which, of course, not the first ones, because the Statue of Liberty wasn't around in 1881 yet, but we know that that process is going to happen. The other choice that's available to us is another view from the decks of ships, and yet those ships went in a different direction. And the view that we're seeing is in 1895, this particular view of the ancient city of Jaffa, where about 250,000 Jews will arrive in that same time span. Now, this concept of returning to the land of Israel instead of returning to the Golden Medina didn't happen in a vacuum. We already mentioned thousands of years of yearning to return. But the 1880s were also going to see the beginning of what would be known as a political and ideological movement known as Zionism, which, as we already know, didn't happen in a vacuum, but other isms are happening throughout Europe. And while Judah Leib Pinsker isn't going to be the first to talk about this idea of returning to the land of Israel, he will be of the first. And while he starts his life, of course, as a traditional Jew, as many did back then, but really being pulled into this idea of socialism in its earliest form, is going to be disillusioned because of not only the pogroms of 1871, but the pogroms of 1881. And he will pen in 1882 what will be a cornerstone piece of the Zionist movement, auto-emancipation. And he says that there will never be equality for the Jews. And the only when Jews, there's a basis here of mutual respect, will there be equality. And that's not going to happen, that mutual respect, he says, because this prospect, even though perhaps once there was some kind of respect of the Jewish people, it can't and won't readmit the Jewish people to the status of nationhood. It's so remote. It lacks that autonomous life. And without a common language, a cohesion of space, without us being under one umbrella, why would anyone consider us worthy of that equality? But even more so, he says, we Jews have lost sight of the fact that whether we need it or not, and the Jew is nowhere at home, always an alien. And the fact that, well, we were born in these countries doesn't change the fact that we are seen as aliens. We need to make sure that our watchword is now or never. We can't let this moment pass by. And he says very clearly, we can't wait to be emancipated. Our only solution is auto-emancipation of the Jew. We have to help ourselves, Pinsker says. And as he does this and he directs us to find that common land that we can find ourselves unified in, is going to be within the control of what's known as the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, which goes and has its roots back to the end of the 13th century, Osman I out of Anatolia becomes a small principality into a major world power, is going to, by 1516, 1517, conquer the entire Middle East and even Southeast Europe, and of course, parts of what will be known as North Africa. And within that, the land of Israel. Now, at its height, we're looking at the map that we can see on the screen, but really our focus is going to be when we already see a condensing of that Ottoman Empire, and mostly within this region where you see the circle. That's going to be our focus, because the Ottoman Empire is essentially going to begin its ultimate dissolution at the beginning of World War I and come to its complete end at the end of World War I. But we're not here to talk about the birth of the modern country of Turkey, but rather to focus on what's going on in the 1880s vis-a-vis a return to the land of Israel. And that return will not only be Eastern European Jews who are returning in this new movement known as Zionism, but it will also include other kinds of Jews that have been living not in Europe, but have been living in the East or in Muslim countries, and in fact have been living in those countries for 2,500 years, whether it's Iraq or it's Iran, Persia, or it's Yemen, which were all part of the Babylonian Empire. And these Jews who return from Yemen in this particular case is part of the first Aliyah, as it will be called, that return of Jews to the land of Israel between 1882 and 1903, the first wave of immigration, or in Hebrew, the first Aliyah, will include Jews from Yemen who are coming for purely religious reasons, not political ones, but religious ones, because they feel that this is a messianic era, because in the Song of Songs, Amalti e'ale betamar, let me climb the palm, it says, Bit Tamar, the palm tree, has a numerical value of 642, and in the year of 1882 was 5,642 of the Jewish calendar. This was a messianic moment. And in fact, those Jews from Yemen wanted to be within those box seats for the coming of the Messiah. Either way, the first Aliyah, and we're about 7 minutes out of the end of our first session here, maybe 8 minutes. But I wanted to at least open up this family album we have of the first Aliyah, 1882 to 1903. And the first wave of immigration will start as an attempt to, reclaim the land. When I say reclaim the land, I mean work the land, agriculturally speaking. And oh, by the way, who was in charge of the land? The Ottoman Turks. We mentioned this already. Now, when Jews begin to arrive in the first Aliyah, there are already about 20 to 30,000 Jews who made up about 10% of the population of what was then called Palestine, who never left. Now, either they never left when the Second Temple was destroyed, or they returned at various points along the way for all the religious yearning that we spoke about. By the way, some of it was very much proactive, and some of it was responsive because we were kicked out of countries like Spain, for example, in 1492. Oh, and by the way, coincidence or not, I don't know, but August 2nd, 1492 was not only when Columbus set sail for the ocean blue, it was also the last day the Jews were allowed to be Jews freely in Spain. And we know Jews returned to the land as well at that point. Either way, the Ottoman Turks are selling off parcels of land. And between the Ottoman Turks and the majority of the population, who were the Arab farmers and peasants who worked the land for the Ottomans, land ownership, we have to be careful when we use our modern sensibilities of language describing what we know land ownership to mean, and superimpose it on a time when it meant very different things. In that, in many ways, the Arab population of Palestine in the 19th century, the late 19th century, they served really as serfs within the greater Ottoman Empire. Either way, wealthy Jewish philanthropists such as Montefiore and Rothschild are going to go ahead and purchase land from the Ottoman Turks or from the wealthy Arab absentee landlords called effendis. And with that will create the first kind of settlement of Jews in the land of Israel, in Palestine, in modern times, called a moshava. Not a moshav, not a kibbutz, but a moshava, which was a kind of township that we can see here, like Gadara and Hadera. And, well, we really didn't know what we were doing. And yet, people like Rothschild would even bring their clerks from France in order to help us figure out how to create these townships. But the truth is that it was very, very difficult. And about half of those who arrived in the first Aliyah actually either died or left, mostly died of malaria until we eradicated that here in the land of Israel and Palestine. But more important than talking about big pictures, to talk about some individuals, including the gentleman you see on the screen, whose name is Eliezer ben Yehuda. Also started his life as a traditional Jew, but very much was caught up in all of these Zionism and these attempts to try and change Jews and evolve and become a enlightened Jew, and Hebrew became his centerpiece. And he is in fact going to immigrate in the 1880s to Palestine after marrying Devorah, who he asks to learn Hebrew. And in fact, we will raise our child only in Hebrew. And that's going to be a problem because nobody else was speaking Hebrew in the land of Israel in the 1880s as a vernacular. Sadly, Devorah, is going to pass away. But after immigrating, Eliezer ben Yehuda will marry Chemda. Chemda is Dvorah's younger sister. Now, the reason I'm introducing you to Chemda is because she will be shoulder to shoulder with Eliezer ben Yehuda as he creates 17 volumes of what will become the first modern Hebrew dictionary. She will run the entire business of creating a modern Hebrew language and will begin to write herself a byline in the local newspaper that they created, even when she runs the whole business. But even more important than that, she will be a voice for women in this time to speak up long before other modern, quote unquote, Western countries were allowing women that voice. And she says, Chemda, and you know which of you can accomplish the most? The girls. You cannot guess what a woman says, she says in the beginning of the 20th century, what a woman can achieve. And she goes on to really talk about equality of the genders in a time when nobody else was speaking about that. But Eliezer ben Yehuda and his wife Chemda would be the forerunners of the establishers of the modern language of Hebrew. Now, the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the gentleman that the rabbi had mentioned as the cornerstone of this Zionist movement. And while Theodor Herzl himself, born in 1860 in the Pest part of Budapest, would say anything he says has already been said by others before him. And born in 1860, when he was 17 years old, his older sister passes away, and the family is going to move to Vienna from Budapest. And when they move there, he marries, ultimately he's going to marry Julie after he graduates from law school. Now, he went to law school because his mother wanted him to be a lawyer. He himself, however, wanted to be a writer. And after he graduates, he actually goes back to being that writer, and he writes for the new Free Press of Vienna. Now, the reason I tell you about his literary journey is because in 1894, he is going to be sent to Paris to cover the hottest story of the day. And the hottest story of the day was a Jewish captain in the French artillery by the name of Alfred Dreyfus, who enlisted into the French artillery in 1877. This is 1894. He's a colonel, he's a captain, and he's accused of espionage, falsely, I'll add, for the Germans. Now, he will be put on trial, and Herzl is in the streets covering this, and he hears death to the Germans. Oh, that's good. Death to the traitors. Oh, I got that. Death to the Jews. To the who now? To the Jews? Why the Jews? Now, it should be said that throughout the entire trial, not only does Dreyfus demand his innocence, he never lets go on his patriotism to France. Walking out in shackles, he says, "Viva la France!" Now, it will become clear soon enough that this was a sham. And even though there's a retrial, it's going to be clear that he was framed. And even though it's clear he's sentenced first to death, then to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. But then, when local French, such as Émile Zola, great thinkers and writers and philosophers, writes J'accuse, he's speaking about the French government and this whole cover-up. Ultimately, in 1906, he will be released from prison, return to the army, be reinstated, and will ultimately retire as a full colonel. And he dies in 1935. And it's not that this anti-Semitism that Herzl sees in France is a wake-up call, because he saw that his entire adult life. Not that he grew up a disassociated Jew. He grew up in that Jewish Enlightenment, German, modern Jewish life in Budapest and then in Vienna. And as he sees this moment in France will be a watershed moment for Herzl, as he understands that if this can happen in the mother of all democracies in France, it can happen anywhere. And therefore, a new trajectory for Herzl is found that will lead him to the time of 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, which is the image that we see in front of us, where he convenes what will be known as the First World Zionist Congress. The first time in a very long time, perhaps since the dissolution of the Sanhedrin itself in the year 425 to the Common Era, when the Byzantine Roman Empire outlaws Judaism, that the Jewish world comes together to discuss the Jewish future. And it will be this gentleman here who, after remarks at the beginning of the conference, in which there were over 100 delegates and 17 women. I'm not saying that tongue-in-cheek. From the Second World Zionist Congress, women were given the vote. Now think about suffrage in England, in America. And this is in 1897. We're trying to create an equal society. And at the same time, as you can see the opening words of Theodor Herzl, we are here to lay the foundation stone of the house, which is to shelter the Jewish nation. And we will conclude once again with the Jewish bookshelf. And this Jewish bookshelf will now take another book off of it. And this is Herzl's diary. And Herzl concludes the First World Zionist Congress as he goes back to his room in the hotel above the casino. And he writes, were I to summarize the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing it publicly, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this aloud, I would be answered by universal laughter. If not in 5 years, certainly in 50 years, everyone will know it. He says this in 1897. 50 years down the road, in 1947, the UN will say yes to a partition plan. 50 years to the year. Was Herzl a prophet? Was he a visionary? Did he just get lucky? Well, as we move forward and we see the conclusion of the first Aliyah and open up into the second Aliyah, we will understand, first of all, that it will be a very different kind of Jew that will transform themselves in the land of Israel, which of course will open up to World War I, which will in fact lay the foundation of all of the geopolitical challenges that we will have down the road, which of course allows us to enter into the British Mandate. All of that we will do in our second class.
Bravo, Uri. Wow. By the way, for those of you who are wondering, being that it is 6:37 right now, that makes it 1:37 a.m. in Israel right now. So impressive. That must have been a cup of coffee that you had in that mug, not water. But bravo. So we went over a little bit, which is fine. And next week, or rather on Sunday, we will get to the part about more about World War I and the British Mandate. However, one question that was placed on the chat that I do want to have you maybe take a look at is Randy asked who was living in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. So as far as the Ottoman Empire goes, and we saw the map before of kind of its ebb and flow. At a certain point, it was a major superpower. By the 16th century, it evolved from within the region known as Turkey, or the Turkish Empire, a place called Anatolia, which is kind of center there. It expanded from a small principality and began to expand by power of the sword and conquest. Those Ottomans, as they were called, it's an English transliteration coming out of the first leader of the Ottoman Empire, Osman I, were Muslim. They themselves conquered the Middle East from another group of Muslims who were the Mamluks, who had come out of Egypt, who had conquered from the Crusaders. But I'm going backwards and not forwards. Within the Ottoman Empire, you're going to see primarily Arabs who are Muslim, although there were also Arabs who were Christian who were living immediately in the region. The majority of people living in the Ottoman Empire were Muslim. even though the Ottoman Turks were not Arab per se, but in the area that we're speaking of, they were mostly Arab. And the Arabs who are living in the Ottoman Empire's part of Palestine are about 80% Arab Muslims, or maybe 70% Arab Muslims, 75%, with 5 to 10% who are Christian. The reason that there are Arab Muslims in this region to begin with has to do with the conquest of Islam in the year 638 to the Common Era, when Islam, which was born in Arabia, so not in our region, but further down south in what today is Saudi Arabia, Islam is born earlier on, and by 638 to the Common Era will conquer all of the Middle East. And from that point on, we see the kind of back and forth, who's going to take ownership of the region, whether it's going to be Christians or Muslims or Muslims or Muslims, which continues to be the case through the 19th century, including the Muslims who are no longer Arab out of the Ottoman Empire. But the co-religionists, as they were Muslims, there was no real love lost. The Ottomans were the superpower, and the Arabs, who were the Muslims, were the serfs or the peasants or the farmers who lived on the ground. And I think we have to also recognize, and this is a good starting point for our next session, is that when we reference the 19th century, in particular the Middle East, we have to remember that we're talking about old world superpowers. And that while we'll obviously talk about the evolution of this region into a modern society with modern sensibilities and modern geopolitics, this period of time of land ownership and conquest and shifting of control, all is still within that old world mentality.
Bravo.
Okay.
So maybe next time you get to do it at a more civilized hour, 10 a.m. our time, 5
Yeah.
your time. That's on Sunday. I hope that to see everyone again next on Sunday. Rather, we are going to again continue with World War I and the British Mandate, and it's gonna, and leading us to the background is critical to helping us prepare and understand what's going on to this.
So, Rabbi, I see that
Yeah.
there's one more question I see in the chat there. First of all, there's no such thing as stupid questions, and I will say that very briefly, of course, I mentioned, just as by the by, the Jews were expelled, that we end by the 16th century already. We see the end of all these expulsions, and that's obviously a much longer answer. We can spend hours and hours discussing why were Jews kicked out, but on the kind of one-footness of it, if we were to go ahead and borrow from our very famous Rabbi Hillel from 2,000 years ago, I would say that there's perhaps a few reasons. One is, well, Jews had no political anchor in any society in which they were living in, meaning they were not protected by anyone unless the kingship or the principality took them as their own property, because Jews were good for business. And the evolution, you can see very clearly as Jews in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple begin to follow the Romans westward. Wherever they were, ultimately, society blossomed. In a sense, they were good for business because, as you know, I'm sure, Jews were not allowed to own land. In fact, there were many realms of business that Jews were not allowed to partake in. Where they were allowed to partake in was money lending, because Christians couldn't do usury. Two, they were allowed to loan money, and they were allowed to be involved in commerce, because Jews were the quintessential businessmen, not because of any shrewdness, but because they had contacts throughout the world, meaning Jews were in every society and they had a common language of business, Hebrew, no matter where you were, whether you were in countries that spoke one language or another language, you could always converse. And also, Jews were never a threat to any of the monarchies that were around, because, as I mentioned, they had no anchor. And when there were challenges within any society. If we take Spain, for example, in 1492, why does Queen Isabella kick the Jews out? Because there's a demand from the local Christians who were there for more payments from the Jews, and Jews weren't putting out more money. And therefore, in order to quell any kind of uprising, the easiest thing to do is to kick the Jews out. This goes along with just good old-fashioned anti-Semitism, even though that too is a modern construct of the 19th century. The anti-Jewish sentiment is as old as time itself, perhaps, if we look at the evolution from the days of Moses in the Jews in Egypt, because we know that Pharaoh is told there's a people different than us, or Haman who tells Achashverosh there's a people who are different than us. We know that in the Middle Ages, the anti-Jewish sentiment is going to evolve in accusations of Jews poisoning wells and the Black Plague and blood libels in which Jews will be accused in the 12th and the 13th century of killing Christian babies to use their blood to make matzah. So anti-Jewish sentiment, for example, Jews will be kicked out of England in 1290. Chaucer comes about 200 years after that expulsion, and Shakespeare 300 years after that expulsion, both of whom have no Jews in their vicinity and produce anti-Semitic work, so that the memory of the Jew is so ingrained in who they are, which, by the way, is very telling as to why Jews chose to be Frenchmen of Mosaic persuasion. The word Jew within Christian society had an embedded antagonistic feeling to it. But that's kind of just on one. But anyway, wherever we were, Jews were kicked out and choices were made. Do I go to a country that hasn't yet kicked out Jews? Or is this the time to return to the land of Israel because I don't want to replace one diaspora with another?
So one last thought, Ori, and that is just to echo what Hannah wrote, and that is those are some pretty impressive graphics you put up there on the screen, and just want you to know, kol hakavod on the graphics, not just the presentation. Everybody, thank you so much. I know it's late for Ori. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I really hope to see you again at the future ones. I know not everyone can make every single session, but if you can, wonderful. And look forward to see you on Sunday again, everyone. Thank you.
Bye,
Good night.
everyone.
Laila Tov.